This podcast is brought to you by Free Buddhist Audio, the Dharma for your life. Our work is funded entirely by donations from our generous listeners. If you would like to help us keep this free, make a contribution at freebuddhistaudio.com/donate. Thank you, and happy listening.
I feel like a very famous person now, because I'll be filmed and recorded. So tonight's talk is called A Body of Practice. So this is the first talk in a series over the next 3 months where we will explore body, speech and mind. And I think it's something that is traditionally in Buddhism, it's kind of used quite often. And you might see people when they salute a Buddha, Rupa, like the one we have on the shrine, doing this. So putting your hands to your forehead means like with body, putting them to the throat means, symbolizes speech, and the heart is mind. So that's kind of a traditional way of saying that we basically practice with the whole of our being, with all aspects of our being, basically. So tonight we look at the first one, body, and I think Buddhism is often talked about as mindfulness or changing the mind or watching your mental states or being aware. And like Buddhism is all of that, but it's not, how can I put it? It's not like what we understand by mind is not really what the Buddha meant. And I think the fact that when we greet a Buddha figure, the fact that we go to the heart when we think of mind actually shows what the Buddha meant by mind, because in Sanskrit, Pali, the word mind is actually chitta, and it's heart mind. So it's not just, it's not the kind of mental activity, the thought processes that we think of. Chitta is actually heart. So that kind of shows us that when we practice, practice is not something that happens between our ears. Practice is something that happens in our bodies, in our activities, I suppose. So our bodies are not kind of passive when we practice or when we start practicing the Buddhist teachings or meditation. So personally, I think that the body is the basis of our practice. It's like everything that happens within the body. So it's like through the body that we experience the world. Those who have heard talks of me before, I think it's a really good reminder to think of the ancient Greeks. They thought as the organ of perception was the heart, so not so much like the eyes or whatever, but actually the heart. So it's like very much like through that kind of, through the body, we experience the world, we interact with the world, and we practice. So often people come to Buddhism because they don't feel quite at home in the world, and that was at least for me the case. I struggled with finding my place in the world. I think I was in my early 20s, and I kind of was involved with things like exotic things like witchcraft, and so there was some magic there. But so we kind of come, to Buddhism, and with this kind of feeling like the world is not a place where I belong. So we try to find our place in the world, but if we want to belong to the world, I think we first need to kind of feel we belong to our bodies. We're kind of at home in our bodies, I suppose. So when we bring in the body, and I hope for those of you that are quite new to meditation, when we do the meditation, I hope you kind of experience that when we bring in the body into our awareness, I suppose, we kind of bring in stillness and stability. So this stillness is not passivity, it's not sleepiness, it's not kind of dozing away, but it's kind of an active stillness. It's taking this interest in our being, in the subtleties of what goes on in us when we're alive, I suppose. I think it's all those subtleties that kind of most of the time we're totally unaware of because we're overwhelmed by much more gross things like sounds and, I don't know, big lights and, whatever, internet. You know, I suppose anything basically that kind of, like we need to return to a place of stillness to experience the subtleties in our aliveness. So this stillness, this active interest is actually, is a receptivity, is developing a quality of receptivity towards our experience and, you know, our how it feels to be alive. And this state of receptivity is illustrated by one of my favorite myths, I suppose, from Buddhism, and it's the myth that kind of describes the Buddha's, I suppose, journey towards enlightenment. So it's a myth, it's a story, so we're not supposed to take it literally. I think like with most myths, if you start taking things literally, it kind of takes away the meaning of the myth, basically. So with this story, there's a lot of kind of evocative aspects of it. So I'm just gonna pull out a couple because that's all what we have time for. But the Buddha, so in this story, the Buddha, who was then still Siddhartha, that was his name, so he's been practicing with a bunch of other people, and they were really, really hardcore. They were kind of the people that kind of don't eat and don't drink and I don't know, kind of put their bodies through all sorts of kind of what do you call them, like difficult circumstances, and they thought that was the way to kind of control the mind, basically. And the Buddha was really good at that. He was really good in controlling himself. He was very, very disciplined. So he hadn't been eating for, I don't know how long, I've forgotten what it says in the story, but a long, long time. So he's totally exhausted. He hasn't eaten, he hasn't drank anything for a long, long time. So at one point when he kind of, he's in a river, I think he's kind of trying to, wash himself a bit. And he's so exhausted that he collapsed into the river, basically. Luckily, he's kind of saved. And a woman gives him some milk and maybe even rice milk and honey to kind of help him recover. And at that point, so this is like telling us what happens when we forget about the body, when we just kind of get too caught up, I suppose, in the head and think that, practice happens in the head and we need to control everything. So we kind of end up totally exhausted, dried out, and we collapse. So after the Buddha kind of takes, the milk and honey, he kind of goes and he sits under a tree and, to recover. And when he's sitting there and resting, he has this memory, and it's a memory from when he was a child, and he remembers an afternoon when he was sitting under another tree. I think it was a rose apple tree, so a nice tree, maybe with a lot of blossoms, and maybe it was this time of year even, because he remembers seeing his father ploughing the land. And so he's sitting there and he feels really, really blissed out, I suppose. He kind of just feels part of the scene around him, part of the world around him. So it's this memory from when he was a child and when he felt at home in this world, and just peaceful and able to experience fully. And that memory of his childhood is actually, it's like the basis of the whole, of what his further practice is based upon. So he remembers the just sitting, he remembers the just being, and he remembers that state, that kind of, that allowed him to kind of experience everything. And so at that point he kind of thinks, well, obviously not eating, not drinking, putting myself through all these, austerities is not doing me any good. So he kind of, he starts eating again. He starts, not a lot, but, enough for his friends to kind of say, you're a bit of a fraud, we don't like you anymore, go away. But he kind of he realizes that actually these practices are kind of I suppose enforcing his ego. They're based on willfulness. So he drops there, and going a bit fast forwarding later, he sits under a tree again. So we're now this is a few days onwards, and he kind of took his vow that he's gonna, sit down and, gonna sit there until he gains enlightenment, basically. So he sits under a tree again, and he's kind of overwhelmed by a lot of doubt. He's like insecurity and thinking, what am I doing here, and am I supposed to be doing this, and do I have the right to be doing this? So it's a bit like his ego starts to fight back. He kind of, I suppose the ego feels threatened and kind of, doesn't want to, doesn't want him to kind of see through things. And so what happens is then he kind of doesn't go in all sorts of reasoning, but he stays still. And what he does is he touches the earth. And at that point, so it's like so he has all this kind of mental stuff going on. And what he does is actually coming back to his body, coming back to the world he's in, and kind of, in the story it's called, he calls upon the witness, the world to witness him, basically. And the world responds, and in the story the world responds by the earth goddess arising up from the depths. And I think that's a really beautiful image, because it's a bit like we all go through our doubts and our insecurities, but if we can stay still and trust the world, it's like the world responds to that, and it's like we can think of the earth goddess as being the heart of the world, or maybe just even the heart, the kindness within us that kind of responds and actually says, no, it's all right, I have the right to sit here, or the right to do this. I'm good enough, I suppose. That's my story is always like I'm not good enough. So it's that kind of the earth goddess kind of telling me, you're good enough. So, and because, then the earth kind of responds, and he realizes it's okay, I can stay here. And that kind of then allows him to kind of start seeing things as they really are, is the kind of jargon, I suppose. So he started seeing like the coming and going, the arising and passing away of thoughts, of feelings, of emotions, anything basically. And in the story it even goes like, the rising and passing away of universes and previous lives. And, so he kind of sees everything. He understands, he understands his experience. The reason I love this story is because it really shows us a way of practicing, and it shows us the importance, I suppose, of being, of just being still. And when we kind of start off with meditation, some people come and they have read about the Buddha and they kind of feel inspired and want to become a perfect Buddha, and other people just come and want to feel a bit more relaxed or a bit, less anxious or something. But then actually when we take up meditation, we kind of soon enough realize that it's actually really hard to just sit and be with what is going on. So just sitting still, watching our feelings, watching our experience is pretty difficult. And if we don't have this sense of our bodies, we kind of just fall prey, I suppose, to, the anxiety, the restlessness. It's like we can't stay with all of this, so we get up and, go and do things like we always do. So the body is really important to kind of anchor us down, and the breath in that is also very important. So in this movement we teach two basic meditations. One is the mindfulness of breathing, and the other is developing loving kindness. So both of them are equally important. But I think the breathing often, well, it depends what kind of person you are, but often people find the breathing a bit more easy, because you kind of have this really concrete thing to kind of focus on, basically, and anchor you down. So when we kind of learn how to be still for longer, we actually kind of start to build up confidence, and just kind of have the confidence that we can stay with our experience, whatever that experience might be. So this building up confidence is a very important one, because as we all know, our experience isn't always easy. And a few years ago, I was on a month-long meditation retreat, and I was having a really tough time, basically. And part of that was because, the events leading up to the retreat were they weren't very happy months in my life, I suppose. So I went through a lot of grief in my, on that retreat, and it really gave me confidence of, how much my body kind of could hold and could support me in going through these processes of grief. And it was like, like going through cycles, and you kind of go through it again and again, and then you think, I feel better, and then a few days later, bang, there you are, crying your eyes out again. So it's kind of coming, having the confidence, or building up the confidence as your body as being this vessel or this container or barrel even of experience, and and not just that, it's also having the confidence, like the Buddha has in this living world around you, as witnessing you. Because I think it was a silent retreat, and about, I don't know, 3 weeks in or something, I really had this experience that I was invisible. and I think this is a really important thing then, to kind of think of, or feel the surroundings, witnessing you in your practice. Because in the end, when we practice, we can talk to friends about it, but a lot goes on internally. So we need to feel that we are witnessed in what we're doing. So when we regain this confidence in our bodies, it's a very transformative experience. And I think most of the time, people trust their head, or they trust their rational thinking, or we kind of somehow have the illusion that we are rational beings, but we are not. So it's a bit like when we think of the head or rationality. Actually, what it is the ego. It's the ego telling us stories, and if there is something that is not very reliable, it's the ego, of course, because it puts us through all sorts of things. It creates anxiety. We build up stories about not being lovable, not being worthy enough, or the other side. We think we're like the best and get really arrogant, depending on which day we're in, I suppose. And I think so. It builds up all this stuff, and the main thing is that it shouts so loud that we kind of start to believe that is who we are. But when we come back to our body, we kind of start to listen, I suppose, to the voice or even voices of the body. So we kind of start to get to know bits of ourselves differently, and we kind of start to realize that actually it's not all this kind of chatter up in our heads that makes us us. There's a whole lot of other stuff going on. So we kind of start to notice all the different pulls within us and the other voices that want to be heard. I'm just thinking of this, I think it's Mary Oliver, who has a poem, which I can't remember the name of, but it's something about like one day you realize that you kind of need to leave and you need to get out of the house, and you have the voices that kind of are pulling you back. And it's a bit like that. It's like you kind of realize you kind of need to go, and you need to go on this path. And, just let go of all the kind of the voices, I suppose, that kind of try to, to pull you back. So, let's go back to being still. So when we kind of be still, we be with our bodies, we kind of start to discover the depth, I suppose, of our being and the richness of the qualities of our inner world. And by doing that, it's like we get to know what the things that actually really that are meaningful to us, I suppose. That's the best way to say it. And we kind of meet the sadness of our hearts when we don't listen to those parts. So it's the body is this kind of this means, this vehicle to kind of show us the richness of our inner experience. And in mythology, you often hear about underworld, and it's a bit like the body. The body is our own underworld. So the underworld is this place where things kind of form, they mature, they kind of ripen and digest. Often, like traditionally, the underworld is the place of the death as well, but it's not the kind of the death of the passive death, not the kind of, I don't know, I suppose the kind of view we get from Christianity, although I grew up in Catholicism, and we had the view that when you're dead you go to heaven and you eat rice milk with golden spoons, rice pudding. But apart from that, it's kind of quite passive, but actually in Greek mythology, in the underworld, there's all sorts of things always happen. So it's a place of activity and of transformation, and also there's I suppose it's the place from which things grow. It's a bit like plants, like plants go down, put their roots down into the world, and from there they grow. So it's a bit like that with us and our bodies. It's like we kind of need to go down into our bodies to be able to grow into the world. So it's not death, it's a place of life where life grows. And when we think about our bodies, it's also like, what do our bodies do? Well, they kind of digest things, don't they? It's like it's a big part of our body is that digestive system. So there's a big image there of like when you be with your body, it's like you can digest your experiences. You can like make things meaningful that instead of like just running from one thing to another. And there's also, in our bodies, there's a lot of space, I suppose. We take up space with our bodies into the world, and so you can like play around with things like that. It's like, what does my body do? And how can I suppose bring my imagination to that? And then the body is also a place where trauma and pain is kept, I suppose. So there as well is like, often, you hear these things about people, you get ill, or people have these kind of things going on with their body, and there's a lot of like emotional stuff going on. Personally, a couple of weeks ago we had these two bomb explosions, one in Istanbul and then a few days later in Brussels, and I was affected by both of them, but I was especially affected by the one in Brussels because I'm Belgian, and it suddenly kind of was talking about places, where I went to university, or that close to where I used to work and things like that. And I basically spent most of that day in with really high levels of adrenaline, like, heartbeats and everything. And I think, like, looking back, it's like, well, I was in shock, I was like a real panic. And then the next day I was just like wiped out, and I got really, really ill. I just caught a bug, and, that was that for me, like, for quite some days. So it's a bit by, my body kind of had to do something to kind of make space, digest, this experience. And I kind of, as Amla Siddhi said, I study as well as working full time. So I don't have much space in my life. And so then, all systems down basically for 10 days. I think it's important when things happen to our bodies that we kind of, we can bring some kind of an imaginative attention to it, and like believe our bodies and trust our bodies, I suppose. Like our bodies hold the memories, they hold our history. I think I'll nearly finish. So when we kind of come down to our body, and we kind of start to get a sense of ourselves in a different way, I suppose. We kind of learn about ourselves in a different way. And that different way is not like a very individual way. It can be even like more of an universal way. Because in a way, we kind of all pretty much the same. I know we're all different as well, but we're also all pretty much the same. And we kind of learn to be with our own reactions, and then realize that other people have similar reactions. So by being with ourselves, learning to be with ourselves, getting to know ourselves, we actually become more sympathetic towards others as well, because we realize that we're not rational, and we shouldn't expect other people to be rational. Like, everyone has a right to be like just outrageous, and so it's a bit, you might think that I've gone a bit dark or something, like, talking a lot about pain and problems, and negative emotions. But I think, I want to stress that, I suppose, maybe I'm a bit negative, and I want to stress that because I know a lot of people kind of come to Buddhism with a hope of kind of being given the recipe to happiness, and it's like, well, I said this is the beginning. It's like there's no magic to be done here. The Buddha didn't give any recipe for any magic. He didn't give you the pill. It's like, take this and then all will be well. And even if he did give you the pill, it's like the next morning you would have come up with new things to be anxious about. It's like we create these things ourselves. So the Buddha kind of, there's no magic in Buddhism. We're kind of very happy to create our own unpleasant emotions. So, I've been meditating for 13 years. I still get anxious. I still get stressed, especially before exams. It's like, it doesn't, and I think the longer I've been meditating, the more and more I've been thinking is like, actually happiness or unhappiness is pretty irrelevant. I think happiness is a highly overstated emotion. It doesn't, it's kind of, it comes and goes really quickly. So chasing happiness, I suppose, is not really what we're trying to do. I think what I have gained in all these years of experience is depth, and is kind of a confidence in my experience. it's a bit of like I got more and more a sense of belonging to my body, belonging to the world, belonging to the earth I kind of live on. And like, yeah, it's maybe kind of having the sense of the earth goddess rising up, whenever my ego kind of throws me and says like, who are you? Thinking you can give a talk, or, who are you? Thinking you can become a proper accountant, or, so it's kind of having that faith, I suppose, that touching the earth. And I think that maybe the biggest thing is kind of having this steady sense of the fleetingness of my experience, of the coming and goings, and maybe that sounds kind of contradictory, of like having a sense of the steadiness of a fleeting experience, but this is like how existence, how life is, I suppose, and it's kind of like I can rely on that kind of fleetingness, I suppose, and kind of surrender to it. So it kind of all becomes more embodied. It has become more embodied over the years. So yeah, I suppose that's all I want to say tonight. And I hope you guys it kind of sets you off, I suppose, on the kind of journey of how you can become more embodied. Yeah.
We hope you enjoyed this week's podcast. Please help us keep this free. Make a contribution at freebuddhistaudio.com/donate. And thank you.